You'll recall from our discussion a couple of weeks ago that structural adjustment programs, now formally replaced by poverty reduction strategy papers but largely unchanged in content, were the policies imposed as a prerequisite for receiving assistance from the international financial institutions. These policies, which generally liberalized the economy while cutting back on the size of the state and the scope of its activities, had sharply gendered implications. We'll explore those implications now, focusing in particular on how they played out when the southern African country of Zimbabwe underwent structural adjustment in the 1990s. Throughout the 1980s, the Zimbabwean economy was doing relatively well. Economic growth rates were steady, and the government was making strides in improving access to schools and expanding healthcare facilities, particularly for the rural poor. The country boasted sharp improvements in life expectancy, as reflected in this chart. And child mortality rates were declining, literacy rates were improving, and other measures of social development were also advancing. Indeed, Zimbabwe was largely seen as a country on the rise. However, as the economic downturn of the mid-1980s placed increasing stress on state resources, and by 1990, Zimbabwe was forced to turn to the IMF for emergency assistance. The International Monetary Fund's assistance was available subject to the normal requirements. The program in Zimbabwe, named ESAP, Economic Structural Adjustment Program, required Zimbabwe to cut government spending, devalue its currency, and undertake broad macroeconomic reforms intended to make the country more efficient and globally competitive. However, as its impact became widely felt across the country, Zimbabweans argued that the acronym ESAP stood for Eternal Suffering for African People, or Sure Advice to Poverty. The impact of ESAP on Zimbabwe was dramatic. Many of the advances made through the 1980s were quickly reversed. Real wages fell to levels not seen since the 1970s, when Zimbabwe was still ruled by a white minority government. Sharp cuts were made to social spending. In the area of healthcare, spending declined by more than 40% between 1990 and 1994. Common drugs and preventative services became unavailable. At the same time, the government imposed user fees which priced healthcare out of the reach for all but the wealthiest 10% of Zimbabweans. Perinatal mortality increased as access to healthcare for expectant mothers declined. By 1992, healthcare providers began referring to ESAP deaths, deaths resulting from preventable causes resulting from insufficient access to medical care or pharmaceuticals. Many doctors and nurses, frustrated by their inability to provide care in the public health system in Zimbabwe, left Zimbabwe for positions abroad, contributing to a healthcare brain drain. And to make matters worse, these cuts corresponded to a period of steadily increasing HIV/AIDS infection rates in Zimbabwe. Education spending per pupil at the primary level collapsed, reverting to pre-independence levels. Primary school fees were introduced in January 1992, and secondary school fees were increased. Such user fees priced hundreds of thousands of students, disproportionately girls, out of education. Government scholarships intended to offset the new fees were able to address some of the declining enrollments, but they could not address the heavy fees associated with attendance, books and materials, uniforms, and other items which were increasing in price rapidly as a result of structural adjustment. Liberalization of markets led to sharp increases in the prices for basic consumer goods, and the cost of foodstuffs increased sharply. A study of the first year of adjustment found that by 1992, the cost of living for lower-income urban families had risen by 45%, and for higher-income groups, cost of living had increased by 36%. The price of bread increased by 30%, sparking a bread boycott in 1993 that lasted for 2 weeks and marked one of the earliest IMF riots. The doubling of bread prices in 1996 sparked a second round of rioting. At the same time that this was taking place, labor laws were being rewritten to make hiring and firing practices more flexible, and wages declined. As a result of adjustment, the number of people living in poverty in Zimbabwe climbed. In 1990, before structural adjustment, approximately 40% of all Zimbabweans lived in poverty, and about 17% lived in extreme poverty. By 1995, 5 years after the introduction of structural adjustment, nearly 2/3 of Zimbabweans were living in poverty, and 1/3 were living in extreme poverty. Writing in Z magazine in 1998, John Peck summarized the effects of ESAP in Zimbabwe. Having swallowed these recommended free market remedies, Zimbabwe's situation has still deteriorated as its terms of trade plummeted and domestic growth stagnated. Worse yet, there was a 20% drop in elementary school attendance for girls, a 27% decline in public visits to hospitals and clinics, a 45% interest rate for peasant farmers and small entrepreneurs, 50% unemployment for high school graduates, 60% decline in real wage income over 1980 levels, etc. Due to the World Bank IMF imposed cutbacks, over 260 rangers were fired in 1993, triggering approaching free-for-all of Zimbabwe's already endangered black rhino population. Land reform has effectively stalled. The government was aware of the broad impact of adjustment, but suggested that these should be seen as short to medium-term consequences, which would be mitigated by expanded economic growth in the long run. These broad impacts had particularly strong effects by gender. Structural adjustments' dramatic cuts to state spending meant sharp declines in social spending, translating into women taking greater responsibility for social care activities historically performed by the state. Cuts to spending on education meant fewer girls in school. Structural adjustment in Zimbabwe also strained the informal safety net. Zimbabwe, like many developing countries, relies on an informal social safety net that connects rural and urban family members. This system was a direct result of labor practices established under the colonial period, when male family members would migrate to urban centers in search of wage employment, while female family members would remain in the rural areas to farm. This system provides a source of income stability for the family. When urban family members are engaged in paid employment, they send a portion of their income back to the rural family to help pay for basic expenses or improvements to the farmstead. When they lose their income, they can rely on food from the rural family to get them by. But during structural adjustment period, this informal safety net came to replace the formal safety net. As a result, it was put under considerable strain. Rural family members, particularly during the ill-timed drought of 1992, did not have the food to send to urban family members who were seeing sharp cuts in their wages and spending power as a result of structural adjustment. This served to undermine the informal social safety net, placing both rural and urban family members at risk. While Zimbabwe's unique situation prevented the emergence of two other phenomena normally associated with structural adjustment, it's still worthwhile to consider them here. Remember that the idea behind adjustment is to open the economy and make the country more attractive to foreign direct investment. This is often done by establishing export processing zones, or EPZs. You'll recall that export processing zones are areas established within a country designed to attract foreign companies by offering tax incentives, lower tax rates, more favorable regulatory environment. The maquiladora, located along the Mexican-US border, are a good example of this. EPZs are often criticized for facilitating the flexibilization and the feminization of labor. The flexibilization of labor refers to efforts to reduce the influence of unions and to make it easier for companies to hire and fire workers. It also includes replacing full-time workers with part-time workers, or shifting from hourly wages to piece rate employment. Flexibilization permits companies to employ workers only when they're needed, thereby reducing labor costs. The feminization of labor refers to a broad trend of increased employment of women in the formal sector. Importantly, the two processes are connected. Because of gendered assumptions about the nature of the family, women's employment is often cast as supplemental. As a result, women are often cast as the most flexible workers. Globally, EPZs employ a largely female labor force, with women comprising an estimated 80 to 90% of all EPZ workers. Many come from rural regions. While working conditions can be brutal, work in the factories is often seen as preferable to the limited options facing them in the countryside. Their labor connects them to consumers in the global north through a long and complex commodity chain explored by McMichael in a text this week. While the distancing of such commodity chains normally obscures the labor that goes into producing the commodity, It's interesting to break that chain down. Did you know, for example, that only about 5 cents of a $100 pair of Nikes goes to the person that actually put them together? Nike, by contrast, rakes in about $13 in profit and spends about $8 figuring out how to get people to spend $100 on a pair of tennis shoes. Similarly, did you know that the factory worker who sewed the $14 shirt is paid about 12 cents for their work? In the 2013 tragedy at the Rana Plaza textile complex in Bangladesh, in which more than 1,000 textile workers lost their lives, drew attention to the working conditions of the women employed in the textile factories around the world. Improving working conditions became a central concern, but only time will tell if it'll make a real impact.